My name is John Sexton, and I'm privileged to move around the world representing New York University as its president, and I'm very privileged to be here this morning. It's a great day for NYU. It's impossible to be here in this moment in these 2 weeks that have unfolded here in our city without thinking first through the lens of the events that came to us with this name Sandy. I am very, very pleased to say that as we moved through these 2 weeks, and for me it begins almost 2 weeks ago as an extraordinary team of men and women here at the university working very, very closely with the emergency folks at the city and state and federal level, but most closely, I should say, with the people at the city level, began the preparations. And the word hero, heroine, is a word that has been used a lot, generally about New Yorkers over these 2 weeks, but it's inspiring to see the members of this community rise to where that word is appropriate. And that is true both where I will be next. I go from here up to the medical center where we're still feeling the effects and will for weeks, frankly, if not months, but where there was heroic effort successfully to evacuate patients, and where there and here, thanks to equally heroic effort down here. I mean, I had in our kind of Mission Central Control, which was established up on the 12th floor of the library, where there were, scores of people from all different parts, from security, from telecommunications, technology, maintenance, buildings, of course the academic people, because we're interfacing. One of the key decisions we had to make, which was not easy when we made it, now it looks very easy in retrospect, was early in the week, on Monday, we decided to call off classes for a week. And that allowed almost 70% of our residential students, our 18,000 residential students, to make plans to move to places where there was power. And that meant that we, in this building, in this room, we had roughly a quarter of the students to care for that we would have had otherwise. This room, I visited this room on Wednesday night to try to keep the students' spirits up. Alec Baldwin came with me. My visit might not have kept their spirits up. His visit and his stories did, and the camaraderie, the spirit in the room was quite remarkable. And the stories, just the vignettes, because it's a New York story, but it's also a human story, a story of resilience. So with the cooperation of a person that will be remembered in the history of New York City as an important contributor to the unfolding of the city, a person who's always loved the city as the city and thought of it in a long-range way, not the way Americans tend to think of things, quarter by quarter, but decade by decade. And I speak, of course, of Commissioner Amanda Burden. So I think we should recognize Amanda. Stand up for. Thank you. But with her cooperation, as part of a kind of long-range plan for the university, we had made a decision, which again was controversial at the time, 5 years ago, because it required disruption for some of our faculty, it was doing something that's not in our core business. You know, we're teachers essentially and researchers. So to build a massive cogeneration plant is not the thing we do day in and day out. But we made the decision that this was important. We frankly made it not because we expected Hurricane Sandy. We made it because it was green and allowed us to be carbon neutral, and for a lot of other reasons, including the fact that it was economical, so it saved pressure on tuition and things like that. But the fact that we had 40 buildings, including this building, including the library, that had light and power was important for us as we staged relief for the displaced students and gave as much relief as we could to faculty, families, and then in gradually expanding circles. I've gotten wonderful emails from members of the community, because little things like, you know, we forget that in this world we've created, people have to charge phones. So just opening up this building from 8 to 4 each day to allow people from the neighborhood to come in and have some water and charge their phones and so forth was an appreciated thing, even if we had to put them out at 4 so that the students could bed down or so this was exciting. But my favorite story is that one of the buildings, not all of our buildings were on the cogen plant, and on the super blocks, as they came to be called in our community, the space between where Washington Square Village and Silver Towers are. There are high-rise buildings down there. And the cogen plant ran to the south block, but not to the north block. This created, you know, because our faculty live in those buildings, so it created a kind of blessed and cursed world. You know, it was hard for all of us. Like, my building didn't have any power, and so I, you know, since my wife died, my children decided I should have a dog. Well, you know, 4 times a day I walked up the 11 flights of stairs and put my little Havanese in my arm and walked down the 11 flights of stairs, and so that Legs, as he's called, could have his walk. But you know, in a way, everything around us was dark, so it was the normal, right? But the poor folks in Washington Square Village had to look out at Silver Towers, which was fully lit, you know, and they could see their colleagues having dinner and so forth. Happily, some of the colleagues in Silver Towers invited some of the colleagues from Washington Square Village over. But my favorite story is there was a fella in one of our buildings, 505 LaGuardia, who was going to run in the marathon. So this person was, to say the least, well-conditioned. And of course, he found out he wasn't going to run in the marathon. But what he did was he got himself a pith helmet with a light on it, and he became the building runner. So people could have food delivered, and he would meet the delivery man downstairs and then run it up the stairs to the older person who couldn't get out of the building. And you know, this is classic New York. And when we realize how fractionated society's become and so forth, when we begin to think about the doom side of the evolution of the world as we see it, you have examples like that. You have examples like the moral surge of our community, and I'm very proud of it. And the important thing, the headline is that in a vast community like NYU, not a single injury, not a single death. We came through it safely, and we came through it with love. So here we are today, and you know, Amanda and I were talking before. We face issues, complex issues, that require the thought of the people in this room. And you have convened in this room faculty and students who are equipped to think about the questions that are before us as we move out over the decades. You know, we live in the capital of the world. And NYU is the university that is in and of this city and in and of the world. And we're committed to making this city the model city for all of the world. And in an array of ways, we're committed to that. And I compliment Dennis, who's a great, great leader, and Maureen for putting this together. And the faculty at the Institute are going to be important parts of this, as with our faculty at Stern and Law, and our engineers in the Center for Urban Sustainability and Progress, so-called CUSP, which, with the cooperation of the Mayor's Office, is committed to develop the science of cities. You know, we're in a point now where roughly half the world's population, half the world's 7 billion people live in cities. I'm sure you all know these numbers. But 25 years from now, 70% of the world's 10 billion people are going to live in cities. That's 7 billion people. That's twice the number of people live in cities now. And in that 25-year span, many cities that don't exist will be created. You know, this is, you look at the history of China, where NYU now has a campus, and there are cities of 10 million people where nothing was before. I remember on my first visit to China, which is getting close to 20 years ago, I was the guest of the mayor of Shanghai. I was dean of NYU's law school. And they had just finished a bridge. It had taken them 18 months to build the bridge. There's fewer permitting problems. There's not a ULIP process. And they'll pay a price for that, right? We have to always remember the Scylla and Charybdis we're dealing with here. But in any case, the mayor took me to the arch, to the apex of this new bridge. We were the only car driving on it, and such that we were able to stop and get out of the car. And as I say, this is almost 20 years ago. It was 1995. And he pointed out at farmland. You know, behind us was the Bund and Shanghai, and in front of us was nothing but farmland as far as the eye could see. And he said, that will be Pudong. There literally was nothing there. That will be Pudong. This is less than 20 years ago. And when NYU's campus is completed in the center of Pudong, on the last piece of property left in central Pudong, it will join, I think the right number, I don't think I'm exaggerating here, 350 buildings of more than 20 stories high. And that is not unique, nor will it be unique looking forward. So there'll be these new cities we have to create, and there'll be the great cities like New York that will have to be, I mean, the daunting questions that Amanda and the mayor and the folks in the city have to begin to just identify for us to look at over these coming decades. So how you sustain a city with all the changes that are going on around us, how you make New York a city which still is the capital of the world. This is, of course, what the Institute is committed to. And of course, now I get to my friend Richard Florida, and this is the final thing I'll say. I have to say that I came to love Richard Florida before I met Richard Florida. Since I met Richard, I've come to love him even more. I came to love him intellectually because I had developed a kind of acronym to describe cities out of my kind of experience of New York. The cities of the 20th century, Mitchell Morse, who's here and has been a great mentor to me. The cities of the 20th century Mitchell taught me and later taught my daughter were animated by fire, finance, insurance, and real estate. But it seemed to me, and it was in conversations with Amanda and Kathy Wild and Mitchell and others in the beginning of this past decade, that there seemed to be something more, and I kind of intuited because I was in the trenches doing talent magnetization. That's what a dean does. Okay, is talent magnetization. You're trying to magnetize great faculty, and then the students follow the faculty, and that's essentially you're an enabler of this if you're a dean or a university president. This is what you build a great university on. And that was what I did, and so I was in the trenches. I was kind of an experiment living out what it is that would help me get Joseph Weiler to leave Harvard to come to NYU, and it was clear to me that part of it was that Weiler would have great colleagues in international law because he was the Jean Monnet Professor of International Law. He had been designated by the European Union as the first Jean Monnet Professor, and they had created a 10,000-volume library at Harvard and given this chair to Harvard and so forth. And he was this eminence. I'm just using this as one. I could have picked dozens of examples, but this was a real issue. Late 90s, I'm trying to recruit Weiler. When I succeeded, he's of such stature that they moved the library and the chair here with him. They considered them ad hominem. But what got him here? I have in my office a picture of Joseph and his wife and his 7 children on the Staten Island ferry with a banner in front of them saying, "Thank you, Dean Sexton." Because what got him here was he had no sense that he was going to come. And I said, "Listen, I just want you to bring your family down for a week. Let's pick Christmas. And you come, the kids will be on vacation, and I'll set up some Broadway shows and some restaurants and so forth." It's funny because Joseph is Orthodox. And one of the places I picked for them to go was the Radio City Music Hall for the Christmas show. And I took my little daughter to it about a week before, and it was the first time I had taken Katie, and her big brother's 20 years older, so it had been a long time since I had taken one of my kids to the Radio City. And we got to that last 20 minutes with the Christmas pageant, and it was so Goyashikov. It was, horrifying. I'm Catholic, but it was horrifyingly Christian. And here I was bringing this Orthodox family down, So my daughter-in-law, my son's wife, was one of the Rockettes, and I said, "Danielle, can you arrange for someone to come 20 minutes before the end to exit them?" But Joseph insisted on staying. And when the family came, 2 years later, after sending me that picture, "Thank you, Dean Sexton," because they had experienced the ice, the intellectual, the cultural, the educational of New York. They'd experienced this city and had been magnetized to it. Yes, he had great colleagues in international law. Yes, there were other elements at the university, but there was this city here that magnetized that family here, and the kids became my advocates. "Daddy, we want to go to New York." And his wife Ruth became, and then my only problem was, could I find a place in New York where they could raise their bees? And we did. We did. Turns out you can raise bees in Riverdale, and you can walk to the kosher. So all of this was necessary, you see. But this is talent magnetization. P.S., as I say, 2 years later when they were here, let's celebrate, pick the event you loved most to go back to. They chose Radio City Music Hall to go see the Christmas show again, to show you the cosmopolitan nature of New York. Well, this is what Richard has been writing about for decades, really. This is his life. This is his life story, and he is the quintessential scholar of this. What was an intuition for me as I began to read his books became actually an idea. And as we ask the questions that are important, it will be research of the kind that he is doing that will inform the answers. So I regularly now recommend to all my students, no matter what I'm teaching, that they set of books. But one of the books on my list, I give them a dozen books they must read that have nothing to do with the course. There's summer reading after the course, and they range from the theological to whatever. But one of them is Who's Your City? Because I say the single most important decision you're going to make is where you live, because that will affect who you marry and what you do. And so the Richard is part of the sinew and fabric of my own thinking. And I have to say, beginning 2 years ago, when he and his wife and I had our first Italian feast at this little Italian restaurant I used to woo people here, the idea grew of his becoming part of the NYU family. And finally, we consummated that idea. And this is, in a way, his inaugural talk here as a member of the NYU faculty. So Richard, onward and upward for the greater glory of God or whatever, but most of all, so that we here in the capital of the world can be a beacon of light of what cities should be. It's my absolute delight, ladies and gentlemen, to give you my friend, my colleague, and my mentor in many ways, Richard Florida.
Thank you so much, John. I cannot tell you how much that means to me. And it's been interesting. John knows, and Rose Scanlon, and Mitch Moss, and many of you here, my wife Ronna knows. I don't usually spend an enormous amount of time preparing for lectures because I kind of know my subject matter. And as you see, I speak extemporaneously. I spent the better part of the last month preparing for this. I generated a deck of 150 slides. I promise I'm not going to show them. And probably 20 pages of talking points. But in doing that preparation, I went back and read several things. I'll talk more about that. But one is, John, I went back and read everything you wrote on the NYU website and everything I could find on this transformation from, as you said, from fire to ice, and the evolution of your ideas about talent magnetization, and creating a center and idea capital, the global network university, the role of New York, this incredible idea John, President Sexton has of a spatial endowment, which is just an incredible thing. And then I went back and I read someone you mentioned. I went back and read, and I'll talk more about this, Mitch Moss's 1991 study called Reinventing New York. And I realized that I wrote Rise of the Creative Class in 2002. I wrote Who's Your City in 2006. In 1991, Mitchell, who knows more about this city than anyone, I'm so privileged to be able to work with you, Mitch, who outlined this transformation of the city from, I'll use these words roughly, direct and routine forms of production or traditional headquarters or basic and routine services to this thing he called intellectual capital. And actually mentioned in that book, 10 years before I wrote Rise of the Creative Class, the rise of an intellectually driven, knowledge-driven creative economy. I intuited a lot of this stuff too. I intuited a lot of this stuff because I grew up, well, I was born in Newark. And it's very interesting, if you're born in Newark, New Jersey, well, I was born in 1957. So I remember the city, and I'm Italian-American. I remember the city as a vibrant hub of ethnic, Jewish, Italian-American, Irish, African-American, Latino, Hispanic. I remember the hum and the hubbub. I remember downtown Newark. I remember Bambergers and Kresge's. My dad worked at Victory Optical. I talk too much about that. My mom took a job at the Star Ledger. In fact, Cy Newhouse actually hired my mom, but that's a whole different story, to take ads at the paper. But I saw Newark as a boy decline. And then my parents moved to suburbia. I say this very loosely. My parents moved to a working-class suburb called North Arlington, New Jersey. If you don't know where that is, it's close to Giant Stadium. It's extraordinarily close to Moonachie and Little Ferry that were terribly flooded out. But I watched that city decline, and I watched New York go through its trauma. Some people romanticize that period and talk about arts and culture and the flourishing, and all of that happened. But I watched all of that, and in preparing for my talk, I also went back and read Hoover and Vernon's Anatomy of a Metropolis. If you haven't read it in a while, 1961, the same year Jane Jacobs wrote Death and Life of Great American Cities, you should read it. Because Hoover and Vernon, and I never met Edgar Hoover, but I got to know Ray Vernon when I taught at Harvard, anticipated a variety of shifts. And it's interesting. In that book, they were talking mainly about how to stabilize the core, how to stabilize Manhattan, how to keep it a flourishing business district in the wake of these terrible forces that were undermining urbanism. The flight to lower density. That's what they say. The flight to lower density. That those who could afford it, just imagine how puzzling this seems now, paradoxical, that those who could afford it were purchasing the movement out of high density to low density. So anyway, what was so remarkable to me was to watch over the course of my career. I became a faculty member. I went to graduate school at Columbia, or Rutgers College as an undergraduate in the mid-70s, graduate school at MIT, and then Columbia in the early part of the 80s, and then a faculty member from the mid-1980s on, to watch this urban transformation. And John, I intuited just like you. I looked around, and in fact, just so you know this, the ideas that are in Rise of the Creative Class actually came from me trying to understand the university I then taught at. It's very interesting that the three universities that have been a big part of my life, NYU, Carnegie Mellon, where I taught for nearly 2 decades, and the University of Toronto, where I have an appointment now and run a research center in addition to NYU, are partnered at this incredible cusp. Well, I was trying to understand why Pittsburgh was losing its faculty recruitment battles. It's the God's truth. I was trying to understand why when I asked our students at Carnegie Mellon where they wanted to live and how many wanted to stay in Pittsburgh, a city that I thought had some assets, not a single hand went up. They wanted to go to more vibrant, energized, talent-magnetized cities. And I was trying to understand why technology at that point could grow up around places like Stanford and places like Boston. But in fact, Carnegie Mellon's engineering faculty in computer science and electrical engineering and in robotics were equal, and in terms of productivity on a per capita or per research dollar basis, and what I figured out, it was all about this talent magnetization effect. And that, in fact, it was this interplay of what John has come to call an idea capital or an idea center or a university putting out these transmission signals in a city. And that's how Rise of the Creative Class was born. What I want to talk about today is the beginnings of a project as part of a whole burgeoning effort of a large group of people to better understand global cities and how global cities operate and what are their mechanisms in what I have come to call a spiky world, but in particular that is motivated by a question I think Rosemary Scanlon, who runs the Schack Institute and is part of my home here. Rosemary Scanlon asked me before I even decided to come, what will the New York economy look like after the financial crisis? What will the New York economy be after this shock that hit Wall Street and the financial markets? And then we started to talk. We started to talk with Rose and with Mitchell, with Hugh Kelly, with Mikia Constantinescu, with colleagues at the University of Toronto, colleagues at the Santa Fe Institute, colleagues, many of here, Tim Marshall from the New School, Rich Greenwald, and a whole bunch of other people, great data people. We started to puzzle over this question, New York as almost a lens. I don't want to call it a laboratory, a lens into this problem. And what we said is it's not just the financial shock. Look at the past decade. New York has been hit with 4 or 5 dramatic shocks. First, there was the tech crash and the recession early on in the decade. Then there was the absolute trauma and tragedy of the attacks of 9/11. Of course, when I was writing Rise of the Creative Class, people said to me, this will invalidate your theory. When people see that our big, dense cities are vulnerable to terrorism, these kinds of attacks, they'll all move out. Not only that, then we had the financial and economic crisis of 2008, and then people said, and I'll talk in a minute about exactly what they said, that New York was doomed, and then there's the hurricane and the weather-related events. And what came out of that conversation, it was the beginnings of this project that I'm going to talk about today, and it's going to be at least a year in incubating, is the fact that New York has emerged stronger. Any one of those crises could have flattened, probably would have flattened another city. But New York has emerged stronger. And why is that? And we believe it is both a set of internal people, the built environment of the city, its densities, but also a set of things that are going on in the world that improve the position of dense, large, creative, energized cities. So to this point, the ideas behind this talk that we titled The Great Reset, Once Again, New York, came from an article I wrote in 2008 when my editor at The Atlantic called me, Don Peck, he's a brilliant fellow, and he said, I really need someone to write an essay on New York. and how it will be left on its knees as a result of the financial crisis. He wanted, and the Atlantic was looking for a piece, the editors there were looking for a piece on how this showed the end of the financial markets, and it would leave New York reeling. Purchasing power, income declines, tax revenues. How would you put the city together again? And I said, because I love the Atlantic, and I edit, and I created Atlantic Cities there, I said to Don, I'll take it on, but I want to look at the problem. I didn't have a prior. Well, I went back and started to look at this, and you may have read the essay. It became the book that I wrote, The Great Reset. I began to look at the problem, and the more I looked at the problem, I said that they had the problem backward. That in fact, as a result of the financial and economic crisis, New York would not be the place left reeling. It would be other sprawling, housing-dependent, perhaps Sunbelt cities, maybe some of the industrial Rust Belt that we're seeing their manufacturing industries eradicated, but places like New York or London, large and not just financial or fire-denominated cities, cities that I'll talk about that had these diverse kinds of economies, would come out stronger. And I was able to go back and read a lot. And that's where this idea of the Great Reset, once again, New York, the Great Reset came from. What we are going through here in New York, and in fact the world is going through, as I learned in writing that essay and then the book, is not a typical business cycle shift. What we're trying to grapple with is a big and fundamental economic transformation. In my view, it is one of the largest and full-blown economic transformations ever in world history. In my view, it's equivalent to the shift that Marx wrote about when we move from an agrarian or feudalist economy to a modern industrial economy. And what I was able to determine by not only studying our time, but by going back and studying the Great Depression, what Hoover and Vernon were writing about was partly the spatial shift and the spatial fix required after the last great economic transformation of the Great Depression. And then I went back and looked at the even bigger crisis of the panic and long depression of the 1870s and 80s. And I looked in very close detail at what happened. And I just want to outline what these resets are. What we think they are is economic crises. What we think of a period like the Great Depression or the panic and long depression of the 1870s, 80s, and 90s is there economic crises and the economy falls apart and we somehow put them together, and what happens is government rushes in and spends money and the New Deal happens, and all of a sudden there's military action and there's new demand and we solve the problem. That's not what really happens. What I tried to do was build a theory of recovery. You know, we don't have a theory of economic recovery. We have a theory of economic crisis, and one of our colleagues here, Nouriel Roubani, is probably the most thoughtful person on that in the world. We have a theory of economic crisis. We don't have a theory of economic recovery. And so what I did was try to tease out some principles. I couldn't go into this full bore. It was a short essay and a reasonably short book, but I could tease out some principles. The first thing that happens in an economic recovery is these periods happen to be the single most innovative periods in the history of capitalism. So when people talk to you about a great stagnation or we've reached technological frontiers, we've run out of innovation and productivity, bupkis. Alvin Hansen wrote the same thing in the 1930s. He said we had reached this period of secular stagnation. The US had exhausted technology and productive forces. When people look back at the history of the 1930s, the great historian Alexander Field, it was the single most innovative decade of the 20th century, far outpacing the high-tech boom of the 90s and early 2000s. In fact, the period of the 1870s, 80s, and 90s were even more innovative. Electricity, electric power, modern transit, modern infrastructure, we can go on. Massive improvements in productivity and manufacturing. Joseph Schumpeter got a lot of this right. These are periods of remarkable creative destruction. They're periods where innovation rushes to the fore, but it's not simply technological innovations, and that's what's so important for our conversation about, once again, New York. The missing piece of the puzzle, and the missing piece that the president and the Congress don't get, but people like Amanda and the mayor here get, I think more intelligently, intuitively and intelligently than anywhere else, is that in fact the key to solving recoveries lie in remaking our geography, in creating a new economic landscape. The solution to the crisis of the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s wasn't simply a round of technological innovation. It was the creation of whole new infrastructures. Electric power infrastructures, plumbing infrastructure, sewer and water infrastructure, cable car and subway infrastructure, rail infrastructure that allowed us to resettle and intensify our use of urban space. Not only in New York and Chicago, but in places like Detroit and Buffalo and Cleveland and St. Louis, you can go on and on. What solved the crisis was the rise of the then what we called the industrial powerhouse city. What got us out of the New Deal was not out of the Great Depression was not just the New Deal or the military spending. It was the rise of a new spatial form, the extensification of land use, and the rise of suburbia. It's exactly what Hoover and Vernon were talking about in 1961, the very year my parents were moving from Newark, New Jersey to North Arlington. The extensification of space and the movement from our cities to a city and suburban metropolitan environment. John probably remembers what happened during that decade as university after university decided they would abandon the city or leave a small, tiny city campus at Rutgers, where I went to school, moving from New Brunswick out into the hinterlands of Piscataway. And you could go on and on. The same thing happened at the University of Buffalo and universities all over the country. This idea of extensification, of outward migration. Geographers call this a spatial fix. It's a really important construct. What solves economic crisis is a spatial fix. Now, these are not 5 or 7 year events. These are generational events, and we're early on it. We're in the first 5 or 6 years of a generational event. I'll just use my dad as a calibration mechanism. My dad was 8 when the economic crisis hit in 1929. He was 40 years old when he bought his first suburban home. And he participated in the fix, the spatial fix of his time. What is happening now is we're in the middle of another great reset, which in part is biased to many of the characteristics of great global cities like New York, but moreover accentuates those characteristics and is reshaping our world in perhaps the most powerful reshaping we've seen of the past 100, 150, maybe a couple of centuries. And New York and other large global cities are well positioned to succeed. And that's what I want to talk about today. And I want to leave time for questions, so I'll try to be quick. The first thing when you hear about the resilience of New York or New York's strength and stature as a global city, the first thing you hear, and it's accurate and it's important, and we're looking at this in great detail, is it's big. New York is a big metropolitan area. And size matters, but size isn't the only characteristic that matters. So I want to say bigness really matters. This great reset is heavily biased towards big places. New York is a metro of about 20 million people, about 1.3 trillion in economic output. If we look at what I call in that book, Who's Your City, the rise of mega regions as we move from city to metro to mega region, you see part of this great reset is not just intensification or extensification. People get this wrong all the time. It's both. We are seeing intensification and densification and more intense use at the core and a preference among many residents and many businesses for the core, but we're also seeing the extensification from city at the first Great Reset in the 1890s to city and suburb in the second Great Reset to the rise of a renewed city and intensified use at the core and the rise of megaregion. The Boston, New York, Washington, Boswas megaregion. First recognized in the late 1950s by an economic geographer called John Gottman. 50 million people, more than $2 trillion in economic output. It's a veritable country with New York as its center. Now, I lived in Washington, D.C., and I'm very fond of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has done very well. It's a knowledge-based, it's a post-industrial metro. It has high incomes, some of the highest incomes overall in the country. And what I would say in Washington, D.C., and it's probably true about your recruiting from Harvard, is that Washington, D.C. has become a suburb of greater New York. Now, I didn't say that to insult Washington, D.C., but to show that the mega region that stretches from Boston to Washington with New York as its center would not be as powerful if it didn't have one of the world's, actually, in our calibration, the single most economically powerful city in the world, New York as its hub. So size matters, but size isn't the whole story. And we'll get to that. The second thing that people say, and I think is an important part of the story, but it's not the whole story, is that it's not just size that matters, it's the fact that New York commandeers the heights of the financial industry. It has strategic importance to the world economy from being at the heights of the financial industry. Now, we've looked at this in some detail. We're going to look at this in much greater detail. Ed Glaeser, a dear friend at Harvard, wrote a piece in the City Journal. And he anticipated, and the piece was called something like, Why New York Has to Move Beyond Wall Street. He anticipated the hit to Wall Street from the crisis. And I think, if I remember this correctly, I'm not looking at my notes, he anticipated that the city just in 1 year between 2008 and 2009 would lost $35 billion in wages and salaries and other economic activity, and that in particular Manhattan lost a preponderant share of this. And he argued in that piece that New York and Manhattan had to diversify away from finance. Well, he's right. But in fact, the city and the metro are already far more diverse than finance. And we did something in this project over the past month that's pretty incredible. Working with a group of data providers called EMSI, roughly Economic Modeling Something Associates. These guys have the best data in the world in real time, not on just an industrial performance, on the occupational distribution of cities and metros and counties. Well, we've had them collate and working with a team here, a team at the Martin Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto, to take a deep dive look into the New York Metro, New York City, Manhattan, and borough economies. And I just want to give you some top-line provisional findings, because these may change, because it's very new and raw data. We looked at all, because it goes back to John's point of talent magnetization. It's very important for people who study cities and urban areas. It's really critical to look at the occupational mix or the talent mix. Most students of urban affairs, until very recently, when they would study a city or a metro area, would study its industrial makeup. They would study the firms and corporations, Mike Porter, a dear friend at Harvard, the clusters of industries that define a community. One of the big advances, just from John's intuition, my own intuition, was to begin to use a different kind of data on employment or jobs or occupations. Not simply what firms make, but what people do. And by looking at this occupational mix or talent mix, you can get a much more powerful view into the actual skill sets and capabilities and capacities of an area. The Bureau of Labor Statistics collects this data for over 800 occupations. So we looked at this in great detail. Yes, finance is important, but Mitchell was right on this and other. New York is much more than a fire economy, and the data show it. In fact, when you look at, now obviously Manhattan's very dependent on Wall Street, cities reasonably dependent. When you look at the metro data, New York has about 6% of its occupations in the metro, in finance and business broadly. It ranks 18th. Places like Charlotte and Hartford and San Francisco, even Washington, D.C. and Baltimore and Denver are more dependent as a metro. It has a higher share of dependence in terms of wages. It ranks 9th. But still places like D.C. and San Francisco and Denver and Charlotte and Hartford. We looked at these occupations, and we looked at something called a location quotient. Don't mean to bore you with what a location quotient is, but it basically is how your city or metro performs relative to the country. And if it's 1, it's equal. If it's bigger than 1, it's better. If it's lower than 1, it's lower. New York had 200 occupations. Think about this. Of 800 occupations, it had 200 that were 20% more than the national average. That was 30% of all jobs and 40% of all wages. So 40% of the wage bill of the metro performs better than the national average. Now, finance was important. For the metro, I'm using rough figures, but my memory is pretty good. The LQ location quotient was about 1.3. New York does about 30% better than the national average. But if you look at these fields that John called idea capital, Mitch called intellectual capital, I called the creative class, science, technology, arts, culture, design and entertainment, business and management, healthcare and education, you get a very different picture. Of those fields, 3 or 4 really drive economic growth and development according to our studies. Obviously, science and technology, and the university has made it important with Brooklyn Poly. The new Applied Sciences campus is leveraging that. That's really critical. Business and management, critical contributors to regional wealth and economic growth and wages and productivity. Arts, culture, design, and entertainment is one of the top three. The Metro's LQ in arts, design, culture, and entertainment is 2. Let's take a look at Manhattan. Manhattan's LQ in finance and management, looking at occupations, is 1.7. Its location quotient in arts, design, culture, and entertainment is 3, almost double. You know what the leading sector, occupational sector in Brooklyn is? Guess what? Arts, design, culture, and entertainment. You know what the leading one in Queens is? The same. If you begin, and we are looking at this as the transformation of Lower Manhattan, I asked Jane Jacobs this question before she died. She became a dear friend. I said to Jane, what do you think about gentrification in Lower Manhattan? What do you think about what's happening in Lower Manhattan, in Soho, and around the NYU campus? And she said, oh, yeah, I understand that in the shops and the chains, and I don't, yeah, they're not that great. She said, but New York's a big place. And she said, when a place gets boring, even the rich people leave. And then you get this expansion. And what's happened, I believe, that's leveraged Lower Manhattan isn't just Wall Street and the financial sector. It was this safety valve, if you will. This collection of old, underutilized, now utilized space in Brooklyn and Queens, connected by subways, and also close to where I grew up and where my brother now lives, in Hoboken. New York, the Metro, has about 3 million workers in what I call the creative class: science, technology, arts, culture, entertainment, business, and finance. That compared to about 33% in the US as a whole. Manhattan, the city, Manhattan, has 50%. When we look and zoom in, and I'll be writing more about this, at the census tracts that compose not just the city but the metro area, all of the census tracts that compose this great metro area. If you look at the areas around this university, in Lower Manhattan, in the adjacent parts of Brooklyn, in Hoboken and Jersey City, the creative economy currently composes more than 80%, more than 80% of all these occupations. This is a broad, diverse economy, and in fact, when we look at London, or we look at Toronto, you could even factor in Shanghai. When you look at the world's most, Tokyo, Seoul, Paris, when you look at the world's most successful global cities, you see something, LA as well, very unique happening. These cities are focused on a set of occupational sectors, on a talent mix that has finance as one of them, but has media, entertainment, arts, and culture at the cutting edge. What are these? These are not only creative and idea-driven, they are very fast-moving, fast-metabolizing sectors. They benefit not only for size, and an important essay I wrote with a couple of colleagues at the University of Toronto and one in Sweden. We looked at the arts and culture mix and found that they not only benefit from scale economies, they benefit powerfully from what we call scope economies. And Bill Baumol here is one of the fathers of this field. Scope economies are where you have a set of related inputs and assets and capacities that a pool of industries and people draw on and enable you to move very, very quickly in addition to having scale. So the first factor underpinning this, which is biased in favor of New York, is this shift to a creative economy. And just a quick background. A knowledge-driven creative economy. This shift that we are going through from the industrial economy to the creative economy that's been percolating now for 2 or 3 decades, that we've all been trying to wrap our arms around, is one of the biggest, if not the biggest shift in the nature of our economy in world history. Marx wrote about the shift from an agricultural to an industrial economy. He wrote about how disruptive, how painful that was, the rise of the working class, the class conflicts that moved through Europe, the Great Depressions. Later we had the crises I mentioned. World wars fought over this. The shift from an industrial economy to this creative and knowledge-driven economy is even bigger. It's even bigger than that, because all of human history before us, we generated our wealth through 2 key assets. One, we were located around natural resources and raw materials iron ore, coal, before that, fertile soil. We developed agriculture, we traded around ports, we developed these big industrial centers. And then in the Industrial Revolution, we added technology and capital. But the primary drivers of wealth were land, labor, and capital, physical resources, brains, backs, arms, and brawn. This time, we're changing the key factor input. We're moving from an industrial economy, where physical labor and raw materials were the key asset, to a knowledge-driven economy. And I just want to spend a minute on this. Other people have grappled with this. People called it the shift to an information economy, a technology economy, a service economy, a post-industrial economy. Peter Drucker called it a knowledge economy. In his studies, by the way, I think done at NYU of General Motors in the 1950s. The reason I call it a creative economy, and I think it's an important distinction, is because I went back and I actually read the classical economists, and I read my Adam Smith, and I read my David Ricardo, and I read my Marx. And what they were arguing, not only as economists, but as moral philosophers, is there was something going on at the point of production that created not only economic growth and development and value, but humanism. There was something in the nature of the production process that was humanistic. And what was humanistic in the nature of that production process, Marx wrote the most eloquently on this, the thing that made the working class a class, the thing that alienated the proletariat, but made it what he called a revolutionary force, was that we were all brothers. We all shared something in common that made the economy go. It was our physical labor. So Marx was arguing that it was not just physical labor that created economic growth. It was physical labor, our ability to use physical skill on farms and in factories that made us human. But what makes us human is the information we acquire, the knowledge we consume, the technologies and service we generate? No. So I stumbled along some psychology one day. And when I went back and read that psychology, I learned something that we all know in a university because we all stand on the shoulders of giants. We all share our intellectual labor. We produce in teams and we harness the dead labor and the people that came before us. We stand on the shoulder of giants. The thing that makes us all human isn't our physical labor. It's the thing you see in every little boy and girl, any one of your children or grandchildren, any kid playing on the playground, your nieces and nephews. It cuts across gender, it cuts across race, it cuts across ethnicity, it cuts across sexual orientation. You don't have to be bigger and stronger to have more of it. It's this thing that makes us human. It's our innate. It's what separates us from other species. It's our human creativity. That's what lies behind this notion that we're moving from an industrial economy to a creative economy. It's not just a set of sectors. It's a basic and elemental economic resource that we all share. And New York, because of its size, because of its scale, because of its diversity, because of its scope and other factors that I'll get to in a moment, is particularly well positioned to succeed and win in this shift from an industrial to a more creative economy. Which brings me to a second major point. If the sectoral mix looks right, if it's in these fast-moving creative sectors, if New York is biased towards those things, there's a second piece of this that I alluded to before, but which is really critical. When we first heard of globalization, we thought that globalization was going to pull us apart. When we first heard of the rise of the internet and new high technologies, we thought that those would eradicate the constraints of distance and would enable people to live wherever they want. They would make our cities and urban areas less important. There were economists after economists, Business Week after Business Week cover stories on this. Tom Friedman told us the world is flat. The world's flat. In a flat world, you can plug and play from wherever you are. And that's accurate. For a certain set of activities that Shanghai rode to prominence on, for simple manufacturing activities, for standard technological activities, for the kinds of things Hoover and Vernon were saying in 1959 and 60 were leaving New York, the trauma of the, I'm just reading the sections on the trauma of the loft factories. It's just so funny to hear the words loft factory go together at this stage in my life. The trauma being of the loft factories in Lower Manhattan. That stuff was being spread out for the better part of the past century. Oh, and it went to New Jersey, and it went to Connecticut, and then it went to the Sun Belt, and then it went to Mexico, and ultimately it ends up in China. But there's a second part to the story, which we all know about. The second part is, as we globalize, we've begun to massively concentrate economic and human assets. Massively concentrate economic and human assets, so much so that in an essay I wrote for The Atlantic, I posited that the world is only partly flat. Most of the world is incredibly spiky. And that's not an either-or. They both go together. The world is flattening and concentrating, disaggregating and reaggregating, deconcentrating and reconcentrating at the same time. Now, Paul Romer and I have had incredible discussions about this, and Solly Angel and his team here. And Paul is one of the few people who agrees with me. So you may think this is wrong, and many other urbanists think this is wrong, but I'm going to pin it on myself, and Paul and I have talked about it. You know what's happening in the global city system? It's equivalent to what happened to our great industries 2 decades ago. Remember what happened when our auto industry, and our electronics industry, and our computer industry, and our steel industries globalized? Well, we used to have an auto industry in the United States, another one in England, another one in Germany, another one in France, another one in Japan, and on, and we got one. Lots of companies fell out. Lots of companies were destroyed. They experienced creative destruction. Companies at the top of the hierarchy got bigger. There's a simple mathematical principle. It's called the Zipf distribution. I don't want to go too deeply into this, but it basically says that in all of social, behavioral, physical, and biological phenomenon, they follow a simple rank order distribution, where the biggest one is 2 times bigger than the next one, and that's 4 times bigger than the next 4, and on and on and on. Rank order distribution. That's what's happening to our city system. There's no doubt. As Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Phoenix and smaller cities experience trauma, at the top of the hierarchy, New York and London and Shanghai and Tokyo are fighting for that dominant spot. That's the shakeout we are going through. There is a fight for that top position, an enormous shakeout as the world economy and city system globalizes. That means the biggest get bigger, and the biggest get even bigger. And that's the kind of thing we're going through. And New York looks, at least to my estimation, because of its density, because of its occupational mix, because of its diversity, because of its openness to talent, because of everything John and others have done to build this as an idea capital, although London's pretty tough on that score too, with knowledge-based institutions, New York looks like a place that is benefiting from that shift inordinately. Now, where do you see this? Housing prices. The housing prices in New York, in the city, in Manhattan, as we all know, are not just being driven by local residents. The housing prices are being driven by New York's rise as a global city, not just a global city for corporate headquarters, not just a global city for multinational firms, not just a global city for foreign direct investment, but a global city for talent. And one of the things I wrote about in Rise of the Creative Class, and I think it's still true, is when you look at great cities and you look at their economic performance, there are 3 things that are critical. Technology, a key asset, having great universities, having technological capability, scientific assets. But as I learned in my time in Pittsburgh, even if you have great universities, Carnegie Mellon, University of Pittsburgh, those technological assets can bleed away if the community's not absorbing them. You have to be a talent magnet. You have to be a place that not only generates talent, because talent can leave. Talent can say after it's educated, we're going to go wherever we want. The third T is critical. You have to have tolerance. You have to be an open-minded place that people from every part of the world, every ethnicity, the creative economy annihilates the social categories we imposed upon ourselves. Gender, race, sexual orientation, age, disability. I mean, you can go on and on. The creative age leverages and enhances the place that are open to everyone across the spectrum. But there are certain things going on in this new spatial fix, certain things that are going on this shift to a spiky, knowledge-driven, intellectually driven creative economy that are very much in addition in New York's favor. I can talk about a lot of those, But the one that really struck us, and the one that is amazing to me, and the one that I'm devoting a lot of my own time, and this project is very concerned about, but I'd say it's one of the 2 or 3 things I'm devoting most of my own time, is this dramatic shift over the past 5 or 6 years in the location and industrial structure, the spatial structure of high-tech industries. Now, even when I was writing Rise of the Creative Class, even when I was writing Hoosier City, even when I was writing The Great Reset, people would tell you that one of the big problems with my own theory, one of the big problems with my own theory, is that I got high technology industries wrong. That, of course, they would say for the artsy people, the bohemians, the professors, who's John's recruiting, who like this cosmopolitan world, for the poets, the musicians, the entertainment figures, the media figures, the writers, the people who are a little quirky and a little off. Of course they love the city, but not for the serious people making new technology. Not for the people building the technologies that are driving our lives. They are suburban. My dear friend, he is a friend, Joel Kotkin, gave this a name. He called it, Florida's crazy. His cities are fine. He called it, what the high-tech people want is a nerdistan. I love that word, a nerdistan. They want an industrial office park in Silicon Valley or suburban Seattle or suburban New Jersey or suburban Connecticut. You know, every city went to build one of these. We need our industrial incubation suburban park. We're going to build this, and all the companies are going to come. What has happened, and I got to tell you guys, we have the most detailed data on this in human history. We got the data, a very good friend at Thomson Reuters, and Dow Jones. We have the data not only on venture capital financed high-tech firms. That data, if you look online, is a mess. They have some cities, some metros, some states, just bad. We got the data not only by city. We got the data not only by area code. We got the data by zip code. We are now coding every single venture capital investment made over the past decade by zip code. Now, it's true. Silicon Valley still has the largest number of deals and the largest volume of investment. But as the Center for an Urban Future report, it's a brilliant report, but our own work is now even confirming New York and New York City is second. It has eclipsed Seattle. It has eclipsed Austin. It has eclipsed Boston. And I have the maps. And when you look at the maps at the concentration of those venture capital investments, it's the same as the Center for the Urban Future, and it comes out, it is all from Midtown South down to Lower Manhattan. This shift to urban tech. I gave a talk at Google when they first opened. It was about Hoosier City, John. I gave a talk at Google, and I said the dumbest thing, as I'm wont to do. I said, it would be really interesting, because I was talking about this thing about location and how it's the most important decision and on and on. I said it'd be really interesting to see if there was a map of where the people at Google live. And of course, 15 laptops were immediately shown to me of the location of where the people who work at Google live. There was one person who lived in suburban New Jersey. The rest lived in Manhattan or Brooklyn or somewhere very close on a subway commute. And I asked the fellow why he lived in suburban New Jersey, and he said, well, I used to work at AT&T Bell Labs, and I'm trying to sell my house in Basking Ridge. The clustering of people, and we know this. And what's interesting about this, of course New York has become a talent magnet. Of course, the new study of Lower Manhattan shows this. Of course, my own research shows this. New York is attracting ambitious and talented and great people who will suffer. You know, Solly Angel told me a great story about this. He said he was living somewhere, I think it was Bangkok, and he said his life was so easy, he needed to struggle to make intellectual contribution. There's just something that draws talented people to this. But it's more than that. It's more than that. We know this. Density creates productivity. And this is what everybody misses. Density is the key mechanism of productivity. When people talk about economic growth, they talk about Bob Solow, technology assets and technological change and the residual effect. They talk about human capital and the effect of human capital in educated and skilled people. There's a third effect that nobody talks about. Well, now with Mike Porter and Ed Glazer and Paul Ramer and myself and a group of people, yeah, and Mitch, it's the place itself. That is the third major explanation of productivity. When David Albuy did a remarkable analysis of the productivity of metropolitan areas, New York, as big as it is, ranks second. Only the San Francisco Bay Area, with that incredible concentration of high-tech firms, was first. density and city and place adds to productivity. And of course, this was Jane Jacobs' most incredible insight. When I asked Jane what was her most important contribution, when we spent time in her home in the Annex in Toronto, she said to me, Richard, people talk about the death and life of great American cities, and I love that book. But she said to me, I think I figured out something that's puzzled every other economist. And she was so humble about this. She said, economists fixated on Adam Smith so much. They were so drawn to his descriptions of the pin factory and that deepening division of labor, and how the division of labor just gets deeper and deeper, and tasks get broken up like Frederick Taylor, and then the assembly line. She said, that's really important. And these big, giant corporations, they can make stuff really efficiently. But she said, that's not a theory of economic growth. In her simple-minded way, that's not a theory of economic growth. A theory of economic growth has to account for where new work comes from. And new work can only come from innovation. And she said, innovations don't come from companies. They come from cities. Innovations come when human beings take their creative assets and combine and recombine. We have a word we use for this with Jose Lobo at the Santa Fe and Mitch and Rose, you, Kelly, and I. We came up with a word. You know this theory of urban metabolism, that places like, and New York is unbelievable, in urban metabolism, it is an efficiency machine in using energy. New York produces about 2 tons of carbon dioxide per person compared to 5 tons of carbon dioxide per person for Chicago or Houston. But we turn that word over. We call it its creative metabolism. There is a creative metabolism, a speed through which denser places can create new things that requires a certain style of built environment. And the flip side of creative metabolism is a second term we've created. We call it the recombinatory rate. The recombinatory rate. When you ask Stephen Jobs what made the Silicon Valley great as a facsimile of a real city, based on a car, he said it was the ability of people to combine and recombine ideas instantaneously, mobilize capital, and create something new. When somebody asked Jack White what created a great music scene, Jack White said the same thing. He said what makes for a great music scene is the ability of musicians to combine and recombine quickly to find that musical edge, talent edge, design edge, creative edge, look and feel that propels them. And out of the mass of musicians, thousands of acts, the mass of companies, thousands of companies, 1 or 2 are successful, and that defines this. But it's fast. It's the recombinatory rate. And that requires density. Now I just have to give one little riff on density. Density is not just massing. And I think here's what we could teach Shanghai. Just having visited the new campus, just being in Pudong, seeing all of that. Here's what we can teach the Asian cities. That density is a mix. I think too many of my colleagues, and too many of my colleagues in urban economics, the same people who were saying that sun, skills, and sprawl were the key to economic growth a generation ago, are now saying all we need is massive towers. And if we pile tower on top of tower, we'll be successful. It's a mix. We certainly need increased density. We certainly need to bring more people in. But we need that mix of densities. And you can see it in a place like New York. You can see it in other cities. A mix of mid-rise, low-rise, high-rise building, and the street-level character which pushes. The problem is in some of the Asian cities where you get vertical sprawl, where nobody leaves the tower and the street mix doesn't happen. It's that mix of densities, those interactive effects that comes from a vibrant city. The connective fiber. Now Mitch is the expert on this, but we're looking at it too, with my group and Mitchell's group and the group that Jacques Cassarda has. The ability to connect to the world economy. In our own research, we find that airports and global connection add more to regional economic development. So this mixture of Newark and LaGuardia and JFK add more to local economic development than high-tech industry structure, and about as much as the skill mix, the human capital level in a metro. Transit connectivity, the subway systems, the ability to avoid having a car. One of the biggest points in this Great Reset when you talk to technology people, when you talk to students, when I talk to my students here at the University of Toronto, this amazing shift from wanting to consume lots of space and wanting to own a car. This shift to wanting to have control of your time and to be able to work wherever you are and to get the things quickly without having to commute long distances by car. The ability to use that infrastructure is critical not only to the attractiveness, but to the ability to combine and recombine quickly. You know, one of the things that's happening in this Great Reset is that we're seeing a dramatic shift away from home ownership. And when I talk about this, I was just talking to the folks at Zillow, and we're going to do more on it. What we find is that it's not an either-or. That what happened in the shift to an ownership society, where President Bush said we want to make a 70% home ownership rate and we want everyone to be an owner and all of this, that, in fact, the optimal mix of renting and owning is about 55 owned, 45 rental. And in those metros that are about that share, like New York, you get more adaptive capability, higher rates of innovation, more flexibility. And when you see metros that have 80 and 85% home ownership rates, and as the people from Zillow said, when you start to see countries with 80 and 85 home ownership rates, you start to see very stodgy, unadaptive places. So the mix of apartment and flexibility, co-op and condo, and suburban home ownership plays a role. I could go on and on about this and other characteristics of the metro that seem to be well positioned. But there's something else I want to talk about. And it came through loud and clear in Mitch's study as well. In addition to talking about all of the assets of great metropolitan areas in the city in that study, there was a section of that study which talked about some of the problems. And if I remember it correct, Mitch, it was an early conversation about the growing class divide. That's my words, the growing divide in New York, but I think in many of our metros. And we hear this conversation percolating through our national conversation, that the United States is becoming more divided. Our cities are becoming more divided. It's true. And it's a feature of the economic transformation. It's nothing that anyone's done wrong. It's a feature of the structural transformation itself that's dividing us. You know, you read the Pew Report, and you look at rates of residential segmentation. We're getting more segmented. We're getting more sorted. Look at the results of the presidential election. I mean, it showed you, as we wrote on Atlantic Cities, the urban electorate carried the election for the president. We're becoming more divided, and we built maps. We'll be sharing them with you. We've built maps of the class segmentation of the metro and the city. It's really interesting. We divide the world, in my way, into three classes. The creative class, the knowledge-driven, professional, intellectual, creative, arts, design, business, management workers. I said that's 36% of the workforce here, 33% in the country, about 40 million workers nationally. There's the working class, my dad. That working class is shrinking dramatically, and of course, taking those good, high-paying jobs that let my dad with a 7th grade education put me and my brother through college. Those working class jobs, if you include not only factory work, but blue-collar work in transportation, moving materials, all of that kind of thing, installation, maintenance, about 22% of the national economy, about 16% of the New York economy. If you look at our maps, you see the creative class concentrated in around lower Manhattan, going up and through Manhattan into Brooklyn, of course. You see the creative class out in some of the suburbs. You see the working class concentrated where? In one place in the whole metro, exactly where I grew up, between Hudson and Essex and Passaic County in New Jersey. And that's all that's left. And maybe a little speck out in the Bronx and another speck in parts of Brooklyn. But literally evaporated. In New York, less than 5% of the workforce, even with the rise of artisanal manufacturing and everything that's happening, less than 5% of the workforce actually makes things. You know what the biggest class is? The service class. Mitch identified this a long time ago. It's a service class. It's more than 4 million workers, nearly 50% of our workforce. Nearly 1 million people work in office and administrative work in this region. Another 350,000 in personal care, service work, personal health care. The creative class averages 75 or 80,000 in wages. Many of those occupations over 6 figures. You know what somebody working in the service industries make? 25,000 or less. It's precarious work, it's contingent work, it's temporary work. And that divide is getting bigger, especially when you take 2 creative workers in a household through assortative mating, what the sociologists call it, and they couple up and their income then goes to 250 or 350 or much more than that, and the 2 service workers are making 40. And the gap's growing wider. More than that, this is really interesting. If you factor in housing costs, people say, do that all the time and New York's expensive. Okay, factor in housing costs. You take the housing costs in the metro, New York City's creative and professional workers rank 8th in the country. It's expensive here, but they make more. They rank 8th in the amount of money they have left over paying for their housing. It's about $3,200 a month, and it's about $38,000, $40,000 a year, something like that. 8th, I think Washington, D.C. and San Francisco are 1st and 2nd. You look at the service workers, the reverse is true. There's nothing left over. It's further and further in debt. So one of the things we have to figure out, not only in New York, but I'd actually put this right at the very top of our agenda for the future, we have to figure out a new social compact. This can't go on much longer. It's ripping us apart. And I have some ideas, and I just want to share them with you. They're not full-blown ideas. The project's going to have to look at them. We're going to have to have much more ethnographic research on this. It's just the germination of idea. I think we have to make the service work better. I think that's our only way out. If we continue down this road where the returns go to knowledge and skill, and we've done the work using the same data, if you look at what makes wages rise, the returns to physical skill are declining. There are two kinds of skills where returns are rapidly increasing. The first is cognitive skill, our intellectual, human capital, our ability to add more cognitive capacity to work. Cognitive skill tends to be concentrated in large metros, but there's another skill that's more important. I call it the Steve Jobs, or maybe it's the Jack White skill. It's the social intelligence, entrepreneurial leadership, social skills that enable you to mobilize resources, be entrepreneurial, manage teams, and to chart a new course. Those social skills are extraordinarily concentrated in the very largest cities and metros. Well, we know those social skills add a lot to creative and knowledge-based wages. We did the analysis. You add social and cognitive skills to manufacturing work in a highly automated, robotized, state-of-the-art factory, the wages of those workers go up. When you add social and cognitive skills to service work, the wages go up the highest of all three groups. So we typically think in the United States of service workers as low skill. They're doing low-skill routine work. They're working in food prep. They're automated, food preparation workers. They're doing simple personal care work. This is the kind of work that is most amenable to upgrading and which New York excels. I get my hair cut in Soho at the Dop Dop Salon. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's very close to here. And I always talk to people who cut my hair. And I talked to the girl who cut my hair there. She's a graduate of the University of Texas with a degree in fine arts. She said, I love Texas and I love Austin, but you can't make a whole lot of money in Austin as fine arts. So she decided to go back to haircutting school. She went back to haircutting school, and she decided in Austin. But in New York, she could take that skill and turn it into money. We have very good friends in Toronto who were makeup artists. They were very good makeup artists. In fact, one of the guys is a fellow who cut my hair there. They decided they could apply that skill to building a company. They built a little company you've probably never heard of called MAC Cosmetics. The transformation of service work has to be high on our agenda, and it has to cut across this bad debate we're in about if we just can elevate wages. We have to add skill. We have to add knowledge skill, and we have to add social skill, and there's a way to do it. Arthur Goldwag, who's back there, who I write a lot with and is a big part of our work, it's the 66%. The 33% is doing great. Now we got to take a look at the 66%. My dad told me a story, and he said, Rich, when I took a job in a factory in Victory Optical in Newark, at age 13, it took 9 of us to make a family wage. His father, my granddad, my grandma worked in a bakery, my granddad worked in a factory. His brother and his siblings all worked to make one living wage. He said, I went off and he fought in all the great battles of D-Day, Normandy, stormed the beach at Normandy, was an infantry soldier, came back from the war, and he said, as if by magic, I had a family supporting job. We always forget that we made manufacturing work, good work. It was terrible work. When Marx wrote about it, when the reformers in New York wrote about it, when the garment workers organized, it was horrible work. We made it good work, and now it's gone. So we got something else we have to do. We have to make together by leveraging skill, and we know how to do that in factories. The factories that did it, that were successful, the factories that I studied in my initial research projects, the factories that I went all over the world to look at in the United States and Europe and Japan, the ones that were successful were the ones that aren't. That's where my theory is built off. It's not a theory of musicians and bohemians. It's a theory built off the experience of the best factories in the world. They tap the knowledge, the creativity, and the intelligence of their workers. That's why my dad told me Victory Optical was successful when I was a little boy. It's because of the knowledge and the intelligence and the creativity of the people who work here. creativity isn't a resource that we all share. We're wasting it. So we have to dig down deep. And I'm just going to give you one example. Sorry to go on so long, and then we'll throw open the questions. We've been working very hard, my wife Rana, who's here, and colleagues, we've been working very hard with a fellow named Tony Hsieh in Las Vegas. I mean, Tony Hsieh is the founder of Zappos. He's a 35, 36-year-old guy. And one of the things Tony figured out, he moved the company from San Francisco to Las Vegas, lower cost. And he figured out very early that he could be successful by taking service workers who were disgruntled in Las Vegas, working in a casino, being not treated very well, or a hotel. He could take those young kids at the time, they're now getting older, and he could give them a purpose. He could bring them to Zappos, and he could give them a job, maybe starting in a call center, maybe routine. It could be very simple work, but he could start to give them a job with purpose, and he could pay them a little better. He started them off at $35,000. Not a lot of money, but better than maybe 35 grand a year. And then he learned that it was creating a culture of welcoming them, their ideas, their capabilities. He wrote a book, he called it Delivering Happiness. That what he wasn't delivering was shoes, but he was delivering happiness, promoting them from within. And we went for the tour, and we met the workers, and they've worked their way up. You know, and it's just crazy if you watch the 60 Minutes, and he treats them well, and now they can make a living wage. Then he realized something. He realized that he was out there in Henderson, Nevada, and he was out there, and all of them had to have suburban homes. They could buy it, they could rent it. Now, it's cheaper than New York. But they had to have a car, and if they had a wife, they had to have 2 cars, and they had the kids, they had to shuttle them around. It was a huge burden. So Tony got the idea. He read the same book, John. He called me one day. He said, Rich, I'd like you to come out, Rana, bring a group of people. I want you to see what we're doing. Well, Tony said, I got to get away from the suburban model because there's another way to add happiness to my people. I'm going to move back to downtown Las Vegas. He bought the old City Hall, and he turned it into his new. It's not fancy, by the way. It's very bootstrap. It's very basic. It looks like it could be in Queens or Brooklyn or parts of Jersey. It's not a fancy Class A office space. It's very basic, you know, retrofitting an old City Hall, a 1950, 60 City Hall. He said, why we're going to do that is because I can then grab some of these condos around here, and I could turn them into shared living space, kind of what New York is thinking about with the micro apartment. I can turn them into a shared communal apartment with shared kitchens, and the people can live there much more affordably. And then what I'm going to do is instead of having my internal kitchen and my internal shops, I can build a little city. And he said, if you want to be successful now, you don't build an industry or firm, you build a city. So I can fill out that neighborhood, and he set up a $350 million real estate fund, which is smart, not just to build his company, but to find local entrepreneurs and local shop owners and bookstore owners and coffee shop owners, and to put money into them to help make them successful, to build a city. And then he said, if I build a city, I can leverage the other part. You see, Zappos not only has service workers, there's a lot of people who work on our technology. There's a lot of people who work on our new algorithms and work on our new ways of shipping and logistics. And I can use them to create new startup companies. He's now attracting companies to downtown Las Vegas. You see, that's the challenge we face. We have a lot of assets. It's a global city. It's doing better in the spiky world. It's leveraging the creative talent, the globalization, the diversity. But the thing that's going to face us moving forward, particularly as the city rebuilds, and we'll talk about that another time, from the hurricane and all of the things we have to do environmentally and with resilience. But the biggest challenge facing is how to tap and harness that creativity that lies within every single individual. And my hunch is, that formation of not only this new creative, knowledge-driven agenda, the formation of this new kind of urban social compact, my hunch is it's not going to come out of Washington. I don't know why I feel that way. Maybe you feel differently. My hunch, having lived in Washington, is Washington is now not a place that innovates. That this new way of forging an urban social compact, which is about harnessing the skill and creativity of everyone, starts in cities. And my hunch is the first place it has to start is here. Anyway, thanks for your patience, and listen to me. We have plenty of time for questions. Thank you, guys. You're very kind. So fire away. And the thing I will say, by the way, is if anyone here, by the way, I have plenty of critics. I learn a lot from my critics. I want to say this. I actually embrace my critics. If you think particularly if you're someone who disagrees with me, if you think what I say is wrong, if you think it has the world wrong, please feel free to say it. You don't have to hide from me. And as part of the NYU community, a university professor, I welcome that. So if you think what I say is good, that's fine. But if you want to say, no, that's wrong, and it's particularly as this project is just embarking, there's something else you have to look at. If you've got that wrong or your theory is cockamamie, please just feel free. That's why we're here. So fire away. Please. It's good if you say who you are, too. Well, first of all, thank you. The question was, if you couldn't hear it, is what kind of qualitative research that I do, and how could I see it being used? The first thing that's important to know is I am basically an ethnographic field researcher. I do not have many data skills, analytical skills. I'm not an econometrician, but I've surrounded myself with some of the best statisticians and computer scientists and econometricians around. I kind of look at the world, just as President Sexton was saying, by intuiting it from my own experience. One of the things that Rose and Mitch and you, Kelly, and others are going to do is really embark on a big qualitative ethnographic piece. So if you're interested in doing this, this is something that over the next course of the next year, we're putting about a year of just the first phase of work on this study, going out and interviewing, looking at neighborhoods, looking at businesses. This is a big, important component of what we're going through. So we'd love to have you part of it. If you can catch any one of it, my email, by the way, is florida@creativeclass.com if you want to send me a note. But qualitative research, along with quantitative data research, will be the backbones of this project and study. It's where all my insights come from. I'm trying to look at hands, please, over there. Well, I've been writing. He asked about infrastructure and airports and all of this. I'm not an infrastructure expert. I know Mitch is doing a lot of work with his team in transportation. It's his focus now. And not only transit and transportation and highways and walkability and bikeability, but also airports. I think this is something we really need to think about. I think the project will take it on systematically and integrally. And we need to make real investments of the infrastructure of the future. I've been writing a lot, and I have a question. I have a conversation today at Atlantic Cities with a fellow named Andrew Zoli. You guys know him? He wrote a book called Resilience, and then John Rose, who we all know, John Rose, urban planner here in the city, about how you build more resilience into the infrastructure. And one of the things that comes out of that conversation is it's not just prevention. That one of the things we have been learning, not only from the experience of New York during Sandy, but the experience of many global cities, it's the adaptability and flexibility that comes to communities and neighborhoods. So yes, we have to make investments in upgrading on our infrastructure and having great global infrastructure, local transit infrastructure, but we also need what we call in that conversation soft infrastructure, not only hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure that enables this very rapid adaptive fiber. And what's interesting to me, you may think I'm wrong on this because it's only emerging. What's interesting to me in tracking this, I wrote a Daily News op-ed in it earlier this week. What's interesting to me is that the densest part of the metro where many, in fact, my friends who are big infrastructure experts always said, density is not good. Density is where you get the real cost. What seems to me to have happened is the densest part of the city adapted the most quickly. So there's something in density, even though there's vulnerability, there's something in density. So I think we have to look at a 21st century infrastructure in a new way. Airports are apart, transit's apart, and all sorts of other infrastructure apart, but it'll be a big part of the study. Other hands? Oh, thank you. And yeah, thank you. If you keep your hand up with the mic, then I'll look for you.
I'm not sure if I'm explaining this right, but when you're talking about Newark and what it was like when you were growing up and you lived in this ethnically diverse neighborhood with all this vibrancy and it had a grittiness to it, and then you move out to the suburbs, and in a way the suburbs just became really white. And I think what's happening, we're seeing at least in a lot of cities, is it's white flight in reverse.
Yep. And
a lot of the neighborhoods end up losing that diversity, and at least what I know of Toronto, a lot of the new ethnically diverse areas are way out in the suburbs. And I just wonder, at some point, is that become too much? Does it become bad? Like, we just walk around in some of these neighborhoods in Brooklyn, and it's just all people that look like me, and it's it's happening at a rapid rate. And I just don't know at what point we almost drown ourselves out. And it's like, the reason I came here is because it was a gritty place. And now I just,
Yeah, you know, Rich Greenwald is here, and Rich has done a remarkable piece on this. He's writing on this, remarkable piece for Atlantic Cities on the tipping points and transitions, and it looked at Brooklyn. And of course, I spent, on the way back from China, I watched 18 episodes of Portlandia. I don't know how many of you guys watched this, but I was just like in stitches. Look, your point's well taken. And I don't think it's just white, I think it's class. And that's why I want to bring class back into the conversation. And many people think I'm romanticizing or jubilating over the creative class. I'm pointing positively to an economic transformation and the rise of a new class, knowledge workers, intellectual workers, creative workers, that are very advantaged. And then this other class of service workers that are being displaced and pushed further. Now, there is a race element, obviously. But it's not just race. If you look at what's happening in Manhattan, many of the most expensive apartments are being sold to some of whom are white, some of whom are Latino, some of whom are Asian, some of whom are Middle Eastern. So there's a big class divide. Now, here's the issue. And this is a big issue. I'm not sure how to solve that. And I'm of two minds on this. And I think the project has to grapple with this. And our country has to grapple with this. I'm not sure we can diversify every neighborhood. I don't know. Maybe we could come up with a supported, affordable housing regime that would make it possible to diversify and have optimal diversity in every neighborhood. I'm not sure we can do that. I'm not sure it would work. And what I think is different today than Jane Jacobs